Sarah, are you under arrest on suspicion of murder of Sadie Hartley?
This is Sarah Williams, and this is Katrina Walsh. And if there was ever a pair of criminal masterminds who managed to be both terrifying yet utterly pathetic, it's these two. Sarah and Katrina fancied themselves like characters out of a crime thriller, but the problem is they didn't have the intelligence, subtlety, or competence to pull it off. Armed with burner phones, GPS trackers, and a diary so detailed it could have doubled as their own confession, they plotted what they proudly called the perfect murder. But spoiler alert, it wasn't. Their victim, that being 60-year-old Sadie Hartley, was a kind, successful woman whose only mistake was falling in love with a man that had at one point in time dated one of them. And for that, she was hunted and then brutally murdered by two jealous fantasists who couldn't even tell the difference between real life and bad fiction. And what followed was a crime so senseless, so needless, and so astonishingly incompetent that even detectives described it as part tragedy and part absurdity. Welcome back to Coffeehouse Crime, folks. My name is Adrian, and today we're in Lancashire, where the hills are gentle, the tea is strong, and these two masterminds redefined the word stupid. Now, my goal here is to bring you the darkest and strangest true crime stories from all over the world, and explore what we can learn from them along the way. And so, if that sounds like your kind of thing, then please do consider subscribing and dropping this video a like. It really does help the channel. Thank you. And now with that said, please grab yourself a coffee, get comfortable, and get ready for the deep dive. This is the case of Sadie Hartley. Welcome to Helmshore, folks. Nestled in the Rossendale Valley of Lancashire, this village is known as a quiet, affluent pocket of England where crime feels more like an outsider's worry than an insider's issue. It's the kind of place where old textile mills sit as relics of the past, rolling hills surround you in the horizon, and the evenings fall into quietness long before the pubs close their doors. With tranquility like this, it is a village that probably feels just right over the long summer days. However, take this as a formerly weathered Englishman, but I can't say the same about winters. The month was January 2016, and winter was fully underway. Much like the rest of England, Helmshore streets are quite deserted at this time of year, where most of its residents are probably trying to keep warm or comfortable indoors. And with so much coziness around the town, it was quite hard to imagine that, in just a moment, something terrible was about to unfold. Found on the southern edge of the village, Sunnybank Road was everything you'd expect from a charming English village home. It was well kept, welcoming, and valued at a staggering £500,000. Quite frankly, it was beautiful and looked perfect for anyone aiming for this kind of cozy lifestyle. Inside of this property lived 60-year-old Sadie Hartley. She was a successful businesswoman, a devoted mother of two, and a partner to retired firefighter Ian Johnston. Together, they were well liked within the village and quietly part of the close-knit community that had forged over the years. However, on the evening of January the 14th, 2016, and behind those very four walls, everything changed in an instant, and Helmshore was about to witness an evil it had never seen before. It wouldn't be until the following day that worry slowly spread from the household. You see, Sadie hadn't been seen for a while. Neither had she been answering her phone or even showing up to work. Friends and colleagues started to grow worried as the hours dragged on. And so, eventually, one colleague made the decision to drive over and check on her. And as important as that decision may have been, it would scar her friend forever. The very moment that front door opened gave way to absolute horror. The metallic tang of blood was heavy in the air, and Sadie was laying face down in the hallway in her own blood. You know, I can't even imagine finding a loved one like that, and I don't think you'll ever return to your former self after witnessing such a thing. It was immediately clear to Sadie's friend that this was no accident. She was in fact murdered, and to a horrifically vicious degree. And so, no surprise, she wasted no time in calling the police. The violence she'd endured was absolutely staggering too, and in total, she had suffered more than 50 separate wounds across her face, neck, torso, and limbs. It turns out that some of these blows were so ferocious that they'd even punctured her bones, and the defensive wounds across her arms and hands told their own story, that Sadie had desperately fought for her life. When officers arrived, even the most experienced of them were stunned. In fact, the scene was later described as an orgy of demonic savagery, which, to be honest with you, is quite the strange choice of words. However, it did also make good headlines across the country. There was no doubt that Sadie's killer or killers desperately needed to be found, and so officers got to work quickly. And while combing the scene, they found one crucial piece of evidence. Upon taking a closer look at her clothing, they found a single small barb which seemed to originate from a stun gun, which in the UK is a very unusual weapon. So, could this maybe help them find her killers? For the moment, all investigators could do was secure the scene and then process what they had found. Of course, the next question was, who was responsible for such a brutal attack? And why would anyone want Sadie dead? Well, the search for that answer would actually unravel a story far stranger and far darker than anyone could have imagined. But who exactly was Sadie Hartley? Born in the year 1955, Sadie grew up in England. Friends and family remember her as caring, gentle, and full of life. And by the time that she had reached 60 years old, she had built a loving family and a thriving career. You see, Sadie had co-founded her own company named Hartley Taylor Medical Communications, and this was built alongside her best friend Julie Taylor. She was passionate about medical science and had an interest to try to advance it with new technologies. Sadie dedicated her professional life to organizing conferences and projects which were all aimed at improving treatments in intensive care medicine, and she was keen on fighting some of the toughest diseases in hematology and infection. Julie would later recall that Sadie could hardly ever stay away from work, and this even included the times just after her children were born. And that's because this was just who she was. Passionate, tireless, and always trying to balance her ambition. And to be honest with you, yeah, I can relate. Us workaholics are just built differently. By the year 2016, her children, named Charlotte and Harry, had grown up and moved out of the property. And although they moved out of the village, they still stayed incredibly close with their mum. In fact, it was only one day before Sadie's murder that Charlotte had phoned her mum with some extremely exciting news. It turns out that she had just gotten engaged. No surprise, Sadie was ecstatic for her daughter and immediately started sharing ideas for the wedding. She was thrilled at the thought of all of the celebrations ahead, and it's so tragic that she would never get to experience them. Back at home in Helmshore, Sadie lived with her long-term partner, Ian Johnston, who was a 57-year-old retired firefighter and a few years younger than her. And together, they led a comfortable life in her beautiful home. They were known as a warm and steady couple who were now just settling into their golden years. Ian would later describe their relationship as cocoa and kindles, filled with quiet evenings, gentle laughter, and a simple, happy love. However, what Sadie could have never known was that the long and dark shadows from Ian's past were slowly creeping into her life. Shadows that would soon tear apart everything that she had worked so hard to build. Okay, so this is the part of the story where I have to tell you about Ian and his love life. And as it turns out, it's not that good. You see, Ian has this certain history about him that Sadie only partially knew about, and it would come back to haunt him in the most catastrophic of ways. It was a few years before moving in with Sadie that Ian unexpectedly crossed paths with a much younger woman named Sarah Williams, who essentially is a professional homewrecker. Their first encounter was quite comical actually, when they accidentally bumped into each other at an indoor ski slope. At the time, Ian was teaching part-time lessons at the ski slope, while Sarah was a travel agent, and apparently their chemistry was immediate. Ian would later admit that in a profound lack of judgment, he would then invite Sarah back to his home shortly after meeting her. And although we don't quite know what he was expecting, Sarah arrived in a miniskirt and high heels. Now, while all of this was going on, Ian was already seeing Sadie. And although the relationship was pretty much long distance, it was still very real. And deep down, Ian knew that this was not innocent. And as you can probably tell where this is going already, the consequences would be cataclysmic. For Sarah Williams, seducing Ian was hardly unusual. Those who knew her would later call her a serial mistress. But personally, I think she just saw monogamy as an allergy. By her mid-30s, she had already spent more than half of her life as the secret side piece of wealthy businessmen, usually upward of 40 years her age. This included an affair with a 60-year-old millionaire when Sarah was only 17 years old, and it turns out that that affair would last for nearly 2 entire decades. Mr. Hardwick was her indulgent sugar daddy and gave her a credit card, a £320 weekly allowance, and would even take her away on luxury holidays across the world more than a dozen times a year. To Mr. Hardwick, Sarah was a glamorous escape, but to Sarah, he was nothing more than her financial security. Now, remarkably, and despite this going on for almost 20 years, his wife had no idea. But even with this arrangement, Sarah would still seek other thrills outside of Mr. Hardwick, and of course, that is when she found Ian Johnston. The affair with Ian seemed to burn hot, but briefly, and by late 2013, Ian was becoming deeply uncomfortable with Sarah. Not only had he realized that he was in love with Sadie, but he also admitted to himself that cheating was a grave mistake. But this is the problem, because although Ian wanted to end it, Sarah had other plans. With Sarah being Sarah, she had become increasingly possessive, and you may as well add dramatic and difficult to the mix too. By October of 2014, and about 2 years after it all began, Ian finally cut the affair. But with her self-absorbed nature, Sarah had no intention of being cast aside. In fact, she became obsessed with him instead. And this obsession would extend past him too. In her mind, Sadie was the obstacle that stood between her and the man she considered perfect. And if Sarah couldn't have Ian, well, then nobody could. Sarah's response was basically immediate, because within a few days of that phone call, Sadie received an anonymous letter in the post. And inside that letter were the grim details of Ian's affair. This letter was laced with all sorts of threats and insults, and Sarah even claimed that Ian hadn't even bothered to change the bedsheets after sleeping with her. Now, I was about to say that Ian was forced to confess, but I think that would probably be an understatement. He had essentially been caught with his pants down, and his relationship with Sadie nearly collapsed. But ultimately, with Sadie being Sadie, she chose to forgive him, and Ian promised it would never happen again. Despite the betrayal, Sadie's love persevered, and the two even decided to double down in their relationship. In fact, Ian even moved into her home in Helmshore, determined to leave Sarah in the past. But as you'll soon find out, that isn't quite what happened. However, rejection only seemed to fuel her obsession. She began to pursue him more relentlessly, swinging between desperate pleading and seething anger. She sent him gifts, wrote him long messages, and even begged him to have sex with her. She would also stalk the many places that Ian frequented too, trying to accidentally bump into him. In fact, on one occasion, Sarah went as far as to breaking into his home while he was away, therefore triggering the alarm system and having police called to his property. Ian later admitted to friends and family that he felt stalked and that Sarah would not let him go. And yet, despite all of this, he made one fatal mistake that would always come back to haunt him. You see, Ian never severed contact entirely, and instead, in moments of weakness, he admitted that he sporadically exchanged flirty messages with her. And this was even after moving in with Sadie. This 1 foot in and 1 foot out behavior never gave him or Sarah the space they needed to fully separate. And no doubt, it would have been counterintuitive to both of them. For multiple months, this back and forth behavior continued, and it turns out that only 10 days before the murder, on January the 4th, 2016, Ian and Sarah had even exchanged more than 30 flirty messages in a single day. But what Ian saw as desperation was actually escalating into something far, far darker, and Sarah's fixation over him was about to tip into something that prosecutors would later describe as delusional, unhinged, and deeply psychotic. Now, there is no doubt that Sarah was both jealous and extremely enraged about the situation, and so she slowly began to plot. In fact, by summer of 2014, which was only a few weeks after Ian had called it off, she told her close friend Katrina Walsh. And by the way, I'm not sure Sarah ever figured out how to make friends her age, because Katrina was nearly double it. In fact, she was 56 and just as unhinged. The two met through a local riding club and, as it turns out, would bond through riding, gossip, and eventually violence. And we know this because the sort of comfort that Katrina gave Sarah wasn't a glass of wine and a shoulder to cry on, but instead the affirmation of following through her sick fantasies. And it turns out that neither of these two were subtle about it either. Especially Katrina. To be clear here, I would never recommend murder, but if you are thinking about doing it, then it's probably best that you don't record every detail in a diary. Alas, Katrina thought it was a smart idea, and so we're going to reference a few of her entries. For example, in one of her entries, Katrina said, "Sarah came around and we got caught up in endless murder plots for Ian's other half. However, what began as spiteful, wine-fueled fantasy would soon harden into something far more real. Because the truth is that Sarah desperately wanted Sadie gone, and Katrina, whether out of loyalty, thrill-seeking, or sheer moral decay, was ready to help her friend. And together, they began to craft what they chillingly called the perfect murder. Over the next year and a half, the pair schemed over and over again. The two were kind of like your stereotypical villains straight out of a bad movie. I mean, Katrina, she certainly looked the part. If there was one thing that Katrina loved more than her horses, it was documenting every detail of her own downfall. Because moving forward, her diary became a step-by-step record of planning the murder, including all of their meetings, the supplies that they required, and their darkest fantasies. They brainstormed multiple ways to kill Sadie, including poisoning, staged incidents, and even hiring a hitman. In fact, in mid-2015, Sarah floated the idea to Katrina's ex-husband, Kevin, asking him if he'd be interested in taking Sadie out for a price. Now, thankfully, he had a little more sense than both of them, and immediately realized that Sarah and Katrina had lost their minds. So, not only did Kevin refuse to help her, but he also refused to ever meet them again, warning Katrina that Sarah's ideas were dangerously criminal, and he also suggested that she should probably make distance from her. However, Katrina did not take his advice. Instead, she poured herself a drink and wrote another entry that evening which said, "Kev not going for the idea of being a hitman after all. Scuppering that idea. Plan B will be needed. Wow, I may get to be instrumental in helping remove that awful woman. Was so buzzing, I needed a southern comfort to wind down." It kind of looks like that Katrina appeared to take some kind of depraved satisfaction in the thought of murdering an innocent woman. And after reading some of her diary, it is hard to disagree. So, without Kevin's help, both Sarah and Katrina decided to do the dirty work themselves. And they would not be subtle about it either. With that in mind, they began their official planning phase, including the collection of tools and clothes, rehearsing routines, and, of course, surveillance. Sarah already knew Ian's habits, but she wanted to map Sadie's instead. For example, was she home alone? Which doors were left unlocked? And how predictable was her day-to-day? Around October of 2015, the pair purchased a covert GPS tracker and then slipped it beneath Ian's car. From that point onward, Sarah could watch the couple coming and going from the property. In fact, the device would later hold 2 months worth of travel history. And it turns out that this was not the only creepy thing she would do. Sadie and Ian would always attend the Chill Factory Ski Club Christmas dinner, and on December the 2nd, 2015, Sarah followed them to this party. While there, she then discreetly positioned herself in the background of one of the group photos. In the foreground, both Sadie and Ian smiled, completely oblivious that Sarah was right there behind them. Katrina and Sarah also bought binoculars to spy from afar, purchased burner phones for secret messages, and even wore strange uniforms to blur their identities. When it came to vehicles, they didn't want Sarah's car on surveillance cameras, so they made the decision to buy a cheap silver Renault Clio under a different name. And when it came to shoes, they ordered men's working shoes but 2 sizes larger, this being in an effort to throw police off their trail if they ever left any footprints behind. And since stun guns are illegal for civilians in the UK, they caught a ferry to Rotterdam and then drove to Darmstadt in Germany and purchased a 500,000 volt device before then smuggling it back to the UK. And it kind of looks like that Katrina was way too excited about their adventure. I'm actually surprised that between Sarah's ego and Katrina's diary, that they didn't send the police a calendar invite for the murder. By early January 2016, their murder kit was now unfortunately complete, but only one thing remained. And of course, that was timing. They decided to strike whenever Sadie would be alone, and it turns out that fate offered a perfect window too, because in mid-January of 2016, Ian had a planned trip to Switzerland. However, even that caution wasn't enough, because in classic amateur villain fashion, they would try a dry run. And believe it or not, but that even meant walking straight up to Sadie's front door. I'm not kidding, by the way, because they quite literally planned a rehearsal. It was on January the 7th of 2016, that being a week before the murder, that Katrina walked up to Sadie's front door and then pushed the doorbell. And the two would even meet, because when Sadie answered that front door, Katrina even handed her a bunch of flowers. And not only was this highly perplexing for Sadie, but the flowers were quite cheap and rubbish too. Definitely not so much a romantic gesture, but more of an impulse buy at the checkouts. It's safe to say that Sadie was completely confused, and she knew nothing about Katrina. In fact, she had never seen her face before. Meanwhile, Katrina knew everything about her. But before she could even get a word out to Katrina, she was gone, which was an odd encounter to say the least. We know through text messages which were sent in the following days that Sadie was concerned, but not too much. I mean, personally speaking, I would probably think it's just some crackhead who got the wrong door. But unfortunately, for Sarah and Katrina, it seemed to do the trick, because now they knew that not only was Sadie alone, but she was also willing to open the door to strangers. And so, with that in mind, they put their fantasy into motion. January the 14th, 2016. As Helmshore lay quiet beneath the winter chill, the streets were still, the air was sharp, and Sadie had settled in for a peaceful night at home. While Ian had already left several days prior for his ski trip, Sadie had spent most of her day working, making calls, and planning for her daughter's engagement. But as daylight slowly faded from the valley, Sarah and Katrina had silently began their journey towards her. They arrived shortly after 7 p.m, driving their throwaway vehicle into Sunnybank Road under the cover of darkness. Armed with an 8-inch kitchen knife and a 500,000 volt stun gun, Sarah was the designated attacker. Meanwhile, Katrina stayed behind the wheel, acting as the lookout, the getaway driver, and arguably the world's most broken moral compass. Sadie's doorbell rang shortly after 8 p.m, and the moment that latch was unlocked, Sarah lunged forward and inside. Armed with the stun gun, Sarah then pressed it against the side of Sadie's head and fired. 500,000 volts surged into her skull, sending Sadie to the floor. And although it didn't render her unconscious, it did leave her paralyzed and unable to move. And from that moment, Sadie was entirely defenseless. What happened next can only be described as barbaric and frenzied. Sarah drew the kitchen knife and then stabbed her dozens of times in what officers described as demonic savagery. Even in her semi-paralyzed state, it is clear that Sadie desperately tried to fight back. Her defensive wounds, which were found all over her hands and arms, confirmed this. But Sarah was absolutely relentless, and in total, Sadie had sustained more than 50 injuries across her body. In only a few minutes, Sadie lay there motionless, with Sarah stood over her body, staring at the scene she had created. For a moment, she simply looked around, and then she straightened up, closed the front door behind her, and calmly walked away. Seconds later, Katrina arrived to pick her up, and just like that, the two then drove off into the darkness. And as we know, Sadie wasn't found until the following day. There is no doubt that while driving away that night, Katrina and Sarah would have been running on pure adrenaline. But the strange thing here is how calm they were afterwards, because there was no panic, fear, or rush to hide. And we know this because afterwards, they drove an hour to Sarah's home found in Chester, changed their clothes, and then watched a movie. and it was Mamma Mia of all films. I mean, as if them committing murder isn't hard enough to understand already, the sheer disconnection between murder and movie is honestly hard to comprehend. They really must have felt comfortable. However, what they didn't know was that, back in Helmshore, the first steps towards their downfall was already unfolding. At around noon of the following day, a friend of Sadie's made the grim discovery. And as we know, that is when officers arrived, secured the scene, and then found a small barb in her clothing. And of course, this is where the mystery of who killed Sadie would slowly begin to unravel. Detectives immediately faced one crucial question: who would want Sadie Hartley to be dead? The thing is, nothing about the crime scene suggested a burglary or a random attack, which made them believe that this must have been personal. And so, they began with the basics, speaking to friends, colleagues, family, and of course, Ian. Now, as is standard procedure in most homicide investigations, Ian was initially treated as a possible suspect, but eventually, his alibi checked out completely. I mean, he was quite literally in a whole other country. Of course, that is when Ian brought up his affair with Sarah Williams and her insane obsession with him. He told officers about the anonymous letter and the strange sighting a week prior, and suddenly, just like that, investigators had a motive, a suspect, and a reason to dig deeper. So, after taking a closer look into Sarah's profile, they quickly discovered her close friendship with Katrina, which, to be honest, probably raised even more questions. Sorry, Katrina, you just have one of those faces. And the moment that officers looked at the surveillance footage around the village, everything else seemed to move rather quickly. The thing is that unfamiliar cars will always stand out in a small village like this. And so, when they spotted a light-coloured Renault Clio passing near Sunnybank Road around the same time of the attack, well, it's kind of obvious that officers would grow curious. As detectives widened their search, even more surveillance footage was found. Cameras showed Sarah's black Volvo driving along Ian and Sadie's street at odd hours throughout December, and on one recording, Sarah could even be seen crouching near Ian's car, retrieving what was later confirmed to be the tracking device that she had planted there weeks earlier. Surveillance footage, which was found at a nearby Tesco store in Halsingdon, also showed Sarah and Katrina buying a cheap bouquet of flowers on the night that Sadie received that suspicious gift at the front door. And so, piece by piece, police built an extraordinarily clear picture with these two. In fact, the evidence was so obvious and abundant that, within a week, Lancashire police moved in to arrest them. Search warrants were obtained, and in the early hours of January the 20th, 2016, coordinated raids were carried out at the homes of Tweedledee and Tweedledum. And ironically, due to a TV documentary crew following the police that week, Sarah's arrest was even captured on film. How's that for coverage? Despite both Sarah and Katrina now being in custody, they both claimed to know nothing at all. But that story would not last for very long. And that's because, while searching Katrina's property, police found everything they needed. That included the 8-inch kitchen knife, the stun gun, the oversized boots, which, by the way, were still smeared with Sadie's blood, and the obvious one, Katrina's diaries. Again, what did I say about murders and journals? By now, the case against these two was quite literally overwhelming. And here comes my favorite part, because you all know how much I love seeing accomplices turn on each other, and that is precisely what happened here too, and I love their excuses. Beginning with Sarah, she claimed that on the night of the murder, she was actually at home and sick, meaning that Katrina must have gone rogue without her consent or knowledge. Supposedly, it was to impress her. And as for Katrina, well, her defense was even stranger. She told the police that she thought the entire thing was some kind of game show. Kind of like Hunted, where participants try to evade capture. Katrina even told the officers that she was scared that Sarah would murder her next, with prawns. In fairness to her, she is allergic to them, but still, it's kind of weird. Safe to say that neither of their stories convinced anyone. Detectives had surveillance footage, forensic evidence, phone data, and even diary entries that tied both of them to the murder. And so, as you can imagine, it was game over for these two. Eventually, and while still in custody, Katrina even agreed to show officers the area where she threw away the knife, stun gun, and all other evidence. All of the items were still exactly where she had left them, and bizarrely, it was all recorded by a TV crew, which I have to admit is kind of beneficial for true crime documentaries. By the summer of 2016, Sarah Williams and Katrina Walsh were formally charged with murder, and their so-called perfect crime had fallen apart so spectacularly that it was basically infamous throughout the country. Their trial ran for 7 long weeks, and the jury was shocked as they experienced all of the evidence available. This included surveillance footage of Sarah and Katrina, the flowers, the murder weapon, the diary entries, and even the photograph from the ski club Christmas party. When it was time for Ian to take the stand, it was obvious that he was quite shaken and fragile. Not only was he forced to recall his affair with Sarah, but he even had to read aloud multiple dirty text messages they'd exchanged, which was probably quite humiliating for him, but also kind of his fault. At one stage, he even broke down in tears, apologizing and saying that he never imagined his foolish decisions could ever lead to something this terrible. He told the court that he'd felt stalked and even tried to cut contact long before the murder. However, Sarah's defense implied that Ian had been leading her on. In addition to this, Sarah also testified that she in fact did not kill Sadie, and that Katrina must have done it all on her own. But the prosecution would rip her theory apart, because if that were true, then why had she spent months tracking Sadie, buying flowers for her test run, and even traveling to Germany to purchase a stun gun? Katrina's defense was not much stronger. Her lawyers portrayed her as an eccentric older woman and a dreamer who had been manipulated by Sarah. And while Katrina certainly was eccentric, let's say, her own diaries would tell a very different story. And so, in the end, and after 7 weeks of evidence and testimony, the jury would only take 7 hours to decide. And in August of 2016, both Sarah Williams and Katrina Walsh were found guilty of murder. As a result, Sarah Williams was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole for 30 years. Meanwhile, Katrina Walsh received life without parole for 25. And to this day, they are still, thankfully, both behind bars. In the aftermath, the media dubbed Sarah as a real-life bunny boiler, which was actually a nickname that Katrina gave her in her own diary, which is quite fitting, to be honest. Sadie's son, Harry, told the court how his mother had been taken away far too soon and through no fault of her own, and described the massive void left behind in her absence. And Ian himself has said he's been destroyed with guilt ever since, and has publicly apologized to Sadie's family, acknowledging that he'd opened the door to someone's chaos. Which is true, I suppose, and Ian should definitely feel shameful. But the other truth here is that he had no way of knowing that this would eventually end in murder. In interviews, he said, "Every day I question why I texted back, and that he also wishes he had recognized the danger sooner." After the murder, Sadie's family asked Ian to move out of the property, and he later discovered that he was never named in her will. A painful but fair consequence. The murder of Sadie Hartley remains as one of Britain's most disturbing modern cases, and at its core, it explains a deadly love triangle which was driven by obsession and cruelty. I don't think that the quiet village of Helmshore has ever been the same, and neither has Sadie's family or children. Sadie lost her life simply because she loved someone. She was a devoted mother, a successful professional, and a kind-hearted woman. And tragically, her life and all of the work she was working on was lost at the hands of 2 evil creatures. I think this story is a really good example of chaos theory and how, in reality, we have no way of controlling who actually comes into our lives. And all we can really do is respect and treat everyone with kindness and hope that we get the same thing back. Anyway, those are my thoughts on this story, but what precisely are yours? To begin with, do you think Sarah and Katrina received the sentences they deserved? As always, please share your own thoughts in the comments section down below. On that note, folks, thank you so much for watching today. I really do appreciate you being here. Please check out my social media here if you haven't yet. And by the way, did you know that I'm now on Spotify? Please check that out too. I'd really appreciate it. Otherwise, I'll see you next week for a brand new video. But until that moment arrives, make sure to look after yourselves and each other. And of course, stay safe and stay curious. Thank you, and goodbye.